He raised his hand to answer a question, one he knew better than anyone in the room. But the teacher didn't just ignore him. He laughed. Some minds, he said slowly, eyes locking on the only black boy in class, just aren't built for this kind of thinking. The class fell silent. Keon Matthews lowered his hand, but not his resolve. Because that night, he found something buried in the school's grading data, something his teacher never wanted anyone to see. Cut to black. The pattern starts here. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The air was crisp with late August humidity, as Keon Matthews stepped off the school bus and into the unfamiliar halls of Hamilton Ridge High. The building stood tall and proud, red-bricked and iron-gated, nestled in a quiet Georgia suburb where polished sidewalks and perfectly trimmed hedges gave the illusion of inclusion. But beneath the surface of every suburban smile was a silent warning. You don't belong here unless you've earned it. For Keon, a 16-year-old black teenager with a mind sharpened by curiosity and resilience, this wasn't just another school year. It was a new battlefield, one where he hoped knowledge would shield him more than skin color would betray him. His mother had worked overtime for months to get him into this school, transferring from their overcrowded district after witnessing how underfunded schools reduced black brilliance into background noise. Hamilton Ridge was ranked in the state's top 5 for math and science, producing scholarship winners and Ivy League admits like clockwork. But walking through the front doors, Keon could already feel the gaze of students pausing mid-sentence to size him up. His uniform was crisp, his backpack full of fresh supplies, and his schedule had one class he'd dreamed of taking for months: AP Statistics. The moment he entered room 304, he was met with silence. Not overt, just long enough to register. The students were mostly white. A few Asian and Latino faces scattered like footnotes in the back of a textbook. Desks were arranged in neat rows, and on the board, written in thick black marker, was the phrase "Statistical reasoning reveals patterns we didn't know we were blind to." Keon liked that. It sounded like something that could change the way the world was understood, maybe even change how people like him were perceived. Behind the teacher's desk stood Mr. Halberst, a tall, wiry man, with thin-rimmed glasses and a gray tie knotted with mechanical precision. His eyes flicked up when Keon entered, narrowed slightly, and then returned to the attendance sheet. There was no welcome, no gesture to a seat, just a pause and a scribble. Keon hesitated, then sat in the only empty chair, front row, center, just feet away from the board. He didn't mind. That's where he wanted to be. The lesson began with terms and notations: population, sample, variance, mean. Keon listened closely, scribbling fast, but focused. The equations felt like music, structured, logical, and full of hidden meanings. He leaned forward slightly, lips pressed together in concentration. But as the minutes ticked by, something became uncomfortably clear. Every time Keon raised his hand, Mr. Halberst ignored it. When he finally called on a student, it was always one of the others, those who smirked when they gave half answers, or stumbled through definitions. Still, Keon persisted. Then came the part of the lesson that introduced standard deviation, a concept Keon had encountered briefly online, during a summer math camp he attended virtually. He recognized it immediately: the spread of data from the mean, the mathematical heartbeat of variation. When Mr. Halberst drew the normal curve on the board and posed a question, Keon's hand shot up instinctively, excited. It was genuine interest, not a challenge. But that's when the classroom air shifted. Mr. Halberst turned, eyes scanning the room, and then locked on Keon's raised hand as if it were a disruption, not a contribution. He paused, took 2 steps forward, and with a voice flat as iron said, "Let's try not to get ahead of ourselves today." The tone wasn't scolding, it was dismissive, patronizing, and loud enough for the class to register the subtext. A few students snickered. Keon lowered his hands slowly, his face a careful mask, but inside something stung. This wasn't about math. As the hour dragged on, the teacher called on others to solve problems that Keon clearly understood. When a student incorrectly answered a standard deviation problem, Mr. Halberst patiently walked them through it. But when Keon whispered the right formula under his breath, quietly, to himself, the teacher turned sharply. His voice, this time more pointed, filled the room. "There's no need to guess if you're not confident in the concept." Keon's cheeks burned. The word guess felt deliberate. The implication, unmistakable. The message wasn't just that Keon was wrong, It was that he didn't even belong in the conversation. His eyes darted to the board, then to the class. No one said anything, but no one needed to. Their silence gave permission to the humiliation. When the bell rang, Keon didn't move right away. He sat still as the class filtered out around him, some offering sympathetic glances, others clearly indifferent. Mr. Halberst erased the board, not sparing Keon a single look. Finally, Keon gathered his things and walked out, head high but heart spiraling. Outside in the hallway, the noise of lockers and laughter filled the space. But inside him, all he could hear was that one line. Let's try not to get ahead of ourselves. It echoed louder than anything else said that day. Not because it was sharp, but because it was surgical. A subtle cut, meant to wound quietly, and it did. Keon spent lunch alone in the far corner of the library, replaying every moment of the class. He wasn't imagining things. He had studied those concepts. He had every right to raise his hand. He had been polite, attentive, curious. But it didn't matter. In a room designed to reward knowledge, his skin had answered the question before his mind ever got the chance. That night at home, Keon's mother asked how his first day went. He smiled and said, "It was fine," but later in the solitude of his bedroom, he reopened his notes and flipped back to the page on standard deviation. He didn't study it to prove anything. He studied it because he wanted to understand it fully better than anyone else in that classroom. Not out of revenge, but out of resolve. What Keon didn't know was that his quiet determination would soon be tested in ways no formula could predict. The classroom wasn't the only place where he'd be challenged, and Mr. Halberst wasn't finished proving his point. The next morning, Keon arrives to class early and asks a simple follow-up question about standard deviation, this time respectfully and with reference to the textbook. Miss Halberst turns to face the class, raises an eyebrow and says clearly, "Some students just aren't built for this kind of thinking." Keon didn't even realize he was still standing until the silence in room 304 swallowed him whole. The low hum of fluorescent lights became deafening. The moment had stretched into something almost unreal. Every student in that room had just heard it. Loud, sharp, surgical. Some students just aren't built for this kind of thinking. The words hadn't been barked. They weren't scolded or screamed. They were calmly delivered, like a diagnosis, like truth. But the venom wasn't in the volume. It was in the certainty. Mr. Halberst had made no attempt to disguise the intention. And he hadn't looked at the textbook. He hadn't addressed the concept. He'd looked straight at Keon, only at Keon, and ended the conversation without ever actually starting it. Around the room, papers rustled as students glanced away. A few scribbled half-heartedly in their notebooks, eyes bouncing like guilty particles trying to escape gravity. One girl looked directly at Keon, her expression unreadable. Before dropping her gaze, Keon stood frozen, hands still gripping the side of his desk. The chalk dust on the board seemed to dance in the light, mocking him with its stillness. And behind him, the echo of chairs squeaking and bags unzipping signaled that the room had already moved on. But Keon hadn't. Inside, his mind was a storm. His question had been valid, grounded in the very lesson they were covering. His reference came straight from the assigned text, not as a challenge, but as curiosity. And still Mr. Halberst had chosen to make him an example. Not of ignorance, but of otherness. He hadn't corrected Keon. He had erased him. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Concepts floated through the air like smoke. Box plots, z-scores, normal distributions. But none of them landed. Keon sat rigid in his seat, his pencil unmoving, eyes staring forward but seeing nothing. Every few minutes he would blink hard, trying to ground himself in numbers that had once felt like an escape. Now even they felt corrupted. When the bell finally rang, Keon didn't move. His classmates began their exodus, filing out with nervous energy, some glancing over their shoulders at him, most just pretending he wasn't there. He waited until the last one had left, then slowly packed his things with mechanical movements. Mr. Halberst remained at his desk, reviewing something on his computer, the glow of the screen casting long shadows across his face. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Keon, as if he'd already deleted the boy from his memory. Out in the hallway, Keon walked like a ghost. Lockers slammed around him. Laughter echoed off the walls. He passed a group of students joking about weekend plans, their voices loud and carefree. None of it reached him. He walked with a stillness that was almost unnatural, not out of calm, but containment. Inside, the quiet rage was building. Not the kind that boiled over, the kind that pressed down like gravity, heavy and cold. It was the kind of rage that didn't explode. It calcified. At lunch, he avoided the cafeteria altogether. Instead, he found the old AV room, tucked away near the auditorium. Dusty, unused, and dimly lit. It was perfect. He sat in the corner and opened his notebook. The same page from earlier stared back at him. The equation for standard deviation, now surrounded by jagged pen lines and smudges. He stared at it, not to study, but to remember the moment it had been used against him. He replayed it again and again, not to fuel resentment, but to sharpen his intent. Back in class that afternoon, nothing was said. No one mentioned what had happened, but that silence was its own indictment. Racism didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered in omissions. In this school where words like gifted and elite were tossed around like confetti, Keon understood exactly what he had been told, that his presence was tolerated, not welcomed, that intelligence had a color, and that questioning a white man's authority, even academically, was stepping out of line. The emotional weight followed him home, where his mother's voice greeted him with warmth that he could barely return. She asked how school was, and he smiled tightly, saying it was fine, but she saw it. She always did. The subtle way his shoulders slumped, the absence of light in his eyes, the hesitation in his answers. But she didn't push, not yet. She trusted that he'd speak when he was ready. That night, Keon sat at his desk long after midnight. The room was silent, lit only by the glow of his desk lamp. On his screen were tabs of college-level statistics lectures, digital whiteboards, academic journals, and forums where people argued over data models, like philosophers debated truth. Keon dove into them with the kind of focus that burned. He didn't study to prove Mr. Halberst wrong. That would have made the man too important. He studied because he refused to let ignorance rewrite his worth. He printed out worksheets, rewatched lectures, and wrote out problems 3 different ways. He mapped concepts, traced derivations, and watched statistics shift from something academic to something personal. This wasn't just math anymore. This was narrative reclamation. Every correct answer was a step away from the box he'd been forced into. Every new concept mastered was a blow against the ceiling someone else had tried to place above his head. What startled him most was how naturally it came. He didn't just understand the material, he internalized it. It clicked in a way that transcended memorization. It became intuitive, almost poetic. Variance, standard deviation, sample bias. They weren't just terms, they were metaphors for his life. How far data strayed from the mean, how assumptions shaped outcomes, how bias corrupted conclusions. He wasn't just learning statistics, he was living it. By 2:00 a.m., Keon was exhausted, but invigorated. He leaned back in his chair, eyes burning from the screen, and stared at the ceiling. His notebooks were filled, pages brimming with formulas and insights. He thought about room 304, about the silence, about Mr. Halberst's cold surgical dismissal, and a thought crystallized, so clearly it felt like an answer to a question no one had asked. He wouldn't just learn this subject. He would master it. In every form, every nuance, every layer. And when the moment came, because it would come, he'd be ready not just to prove a point, but to rewrite the rules of engagement. Because if racism was a structure built on assumptions, then knowledge was the wrecking ball. The quiet rage in him hadn't faded. It had evolved, hardened into purpose. And from that night forward, Keon Matthews wasn't just a student in AP statistics. He was building something no one could see yet. A storm, calculated down to its final decimal. In the darkness of his room, Keon closes his textbook and stares into the glow of his laptop. On the screen is a university-level data analysis course, labeled Advanced Predictive Modeling. With one click, he enrolls and begins solving problems his own teacher doesn't even know exist. The basement was cold, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of old cardboard and pine cleaner. It wasn't much, a storage space with concrete floors and a single dangling bulb. But to Keon Matthews, it felt like a sanctuary. Upstairs, the world was defined by limitations, school expectations, whispered assumptions, and ceilings designed for other people. But down here, beneath the foundation, he was building something no one could control, not even Mr. Halberst. The desk was a folding table his mother had dragged in from a yard sale 3 summers ago. A second-hand monitor patched with electrical tape along the corners flickered to life. His old Chromebook wheezed as it booted up, but it worked, and that was all Keon needed, a gateway into a digital universe, where merit still had a fighting chance. He had taken his vows seriously. That night, after the incident in room 304, after the humiliation wrapped in professionalism and delivered like a lesson, he hadn't just studied, he'd excavated. He mapped every topic listed in the AP statistics syllabus, then tracked parallel university-level curricula. What started as review quickly became immersion. Lecture videos from Stanford, MIT, and Harvard filled his screen, their professors walking through datasets and models with a passion that made Keon's pulse race. There were no condescending looks, no racial undercurrents, just data, raw, honest, logical. He paused, rewound, and replayed every second until it clicked. Then he'd go deeper, into textbooks, white papers, and forums filled with late-night arguments about regression theory and data ethics. His browser history looked like a graduate student's. His notebooks filled rapidly, each one marked by date and topic, carefully indexed in the corner with red ink. But it wasn't just passive consumption. Keon was recreating lessons from scratch. He bought a pack of dollar store chalk and turned a leftover piece of drywall in the corner of the basement into a makeshift blackboard. Each night he'd stand in front of it, imagining he was the one leading a classroom, not just sitting in one. He'd solve problems aloud, challenge himself with blind derivations, and even time his explanations like a teacher under pressure. It became a ritual. After dinner, while the neighborhood fell asleep, Keon descended into the basement like a monk, returning to scripture. His fingers were often stained with graphite, his eyes red from screen glare. But he was undeterred. The concepts weren't just numbers anymore. They were language, expression, power. Standard deviation was no longer a classroom trigger. It was a canvas. Probability distributions became metaphors for risk and reward. Hypothesis testing felt like the closest thing to justice statistics had to offer. He marveled at how statistics could predict behavior, shape industries, or expose systemic flaws. For the first time, he wasn't just consuming knowledge. He was owning it. But mastery came with moments of despair too. There were nights where a complex derivation refused to make sense, when nothing clicked, and he felt like he was chasing a shadow he'd never catch. During those moments, the memory of Mr. Halberst's face, the smirk, the condescension, would return uninvited. But Keon didn't let the memory crush him. He let it burn. One night, after 3 hours of combing through lectures on predictive modeling, Keon found a dataset buried inside a government statistics portal. It was raw, uncleaned data, rows and columns of numbers representing student performance across Georgia, broken down by school district, subject, ethnicity, and teacher-assigned grading bands. It wasn't part of any homework, not even close, but something about the file held him. He opened it in a spreadsheet program and began to sort. At first it was chaos, thousands of data points, each row its own story. But as he filtered and color-coded, a pattern started to emerge, not just in performance gaps between white and black students. That much was well documented. But something more specific. The anomaly was in grading patterns within high-achieving districts. The numbers told a subtle but consistent story. Black students in majority-white schools, especially in AP math courses, were disproportionately given lower participation scores, regardless of their test results. In some schools, this trend spiked around specific teachers. One name stood out in the data, like a dropped knife. Halberst. Keon froze. It was a common enough last name. It could have been coincidence. But the dataset included school codes, and the one next to that name matched the code on Keon's student ID. He dug deeper. A scatterplot showed a jagged but visible trend. Students under this teacher had lower participation grades on average. If they were listed under the black demographic flag, even when their test scores were equivalent to or higher than white peers, their final grades were often half a letter lower. And this had been happening for years. Keon stared at the screen, breath shallow. It wasn't just about him. This was statistical racism, measurable, undeniable, and buried in plain sight. The beauty of statistics was that it couldn't lie, but people could, and did use it to obscure truth. Keon now understood why Mr. Halberst had wanted to control the narrative in room 304. Why his hand being raised was treated like rebellion. It wasn't just about authority, it was about fear. Fear of exposure. Because once you taught a student how to see, you couldn't unteach them how to notice. Keon opened a new notebook and labeled it in bold, capital letters. Patterns they don't want seen. His notes became clinical, meticulous, focused. He cross-referenced the data, with public school reports, anonymous teacher reviews, even alumni posts from forums. The picture became clearer. Mr. Halberst had been using his authority to shape outcomes for years, not blatantly, but methodically. The numbers weren't wild accusations. They were evidence. What had happened in room 304 wasn't an isolated act of bias. It was the visible tip of a much larger, deeply embedded structure. Keon realized he wasn't just preparing to understand statistics anymore. He was preparing to wield it, like armor, like a skeletal, like truth. But he also knew he couldn't act too quickly. If he exposed what he found without strategic timing, it would be dismissed, buried, or spun. He needed more evidence, more mastery, more leverage, so he kept the discovery to himself. For now, and every day at school, he played the part, quiet, cooperative, diligent, the kind of student who didn't ruffle feathers. Meanwhile, every night, he returned to the basement, like a craftsman, refining a weapon, his own private war room. It was there, beneath the floorboards of a house on a quiet street in Georgia, that a revolution began. Not with fists or slogans, but with data. And as he plotted a scatter graph connecting Mr. Halberst's grading curve to minority student retention rates, a sudden realization struck him. The exact data anomaly he'd uncovered. The statistical dip, perfectly aligned with a point Mr. Halberst had used just 3 days ago in class. A real-world example. But he had lied about its origin. The point, the one that showed a mysterious decline in student engagement among lower-performing groups, hadn't been a hypothetical dataset. It was this one. It was his own. Mr. Halberst had used a real-world example drawn from manipulated, racist outcomes, and presented it as neutral truth to his class. Keon leaned back, heart pounding, stomach turning. It wasn't just a lesson anymore. It was a cover-up. Keon opens the original CSV file again, and notices something buried in the metadata. A user ID tied to the person who last modified the dataset before its release. His eyes widen, as the name appears on screen. A Halberst.mn, a Hamilton Ridge. The morning Keon entered room 304 and saw the words, Group Project Assignment, scrawled across the whiteboard. A subtle shift took place in the air. Students leaned in slightly, pencils ready, notebooks open but forgotten. Everyone knew this was one of the few assignments that could significantly sway their final grade, the semester-long data analysis project. In years past, it had earned students scholarship interviews, and even a few published accolades. The anticipation wasn't just academic, it was territorial. Mr. Halberst paced slowly across the front of the room, index cards in hand. With his signature detachment, he began to list the teams. He read names with clipped precision, pairing students who often worked together, laughed in the same lunch circles, or carried the same air of quiet confidence. As each group solidified, nods of approval and casual glances confirmed their comfort. It all felt so organic, like the pieces were falling into place naturally, until they weren't. Keon kept his head down, half listening, half waiting, pencil twirling loosely between his fingers. He had tried to predict how the groupings would unfold, assuming statistical fairness would guide the process. But as the last names were read, and the class murmured with excitement, something sickened him. His name hadn't been called. Every student had a group. Every desk had a team. Except his. The room didn't freeze. It didn't gasp or whisper. It simply continued existing without him, like he was a variable dropped from the dataset. Mr. Halberst didn't flinch. After a deliberate pause, he looked down at the final index card and announced that Keon would be joining the last remaining trio. 3 students whose eyes darted toward each other in visible discomfort. They hadn't been waiting for a fourth. They'd hoped the math would leave them as a closed unit. Now their expressions made it clear, this wasn't just surprise. It was disappointment. Keon walked over to the table. They occupied and took the empty chair without saying a word. No one shifted to make room. No one acknowledged his arrival. In that moment, the subtle racism didn't wear hoods or shout slurs. It wore smiles too polite, voices too neutral, and boundaries too invisible to be named, but sharp enough to wound. Over the next week, the group met during and after class to begin outlining their project. The assignment was complex: analyze a multivariable dataset, identify trends, and create a predictive model that could be used in a real-world context. It was the kind of challenge Keon lived for. But his excitement quickly met a wall of resistance. During their first meeting, he presented a draft model he'd been working on based on transportation inequality data. Something timely, rich with variables, and supported by recent research. He shared printed samples, explained how demographic shifts impacted commute efficiency, and even referenced federal transportation records. But they didn't look at the papers. One student glanced briefly and pushed it aside. Another closed her laptop as if signaling the end of the discussion. The third suggested they keep things simple and work with a dataset already provided by Miss Talburst. One on school vending machine usage. Keon didn't argue. He simply nodded and slid his papers back into his folder. Each time he offered insight, whether about data cleaning methods or improved model accuracy, they ignored it. When he created a shared folder with structured documentation, no one used it. During meetings, they spoke over him, rerouted discussions, or acted as if his seat was occupied by static. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't loud. It was erasure performed with surgical calm. Eventually, they gave him a task: citations. It was framed as a contribution, an essential one, but the message was clear. He could serve. He just couldn't lead. While the others handled datasets and analysis, Keon was expected to format sources and confirm publication years. It felt like being given the broom after building the house. At home, he worked anyway, but not on citations. In his basement, beneath that single bulb, Keon reconstructed the entire project from scratch. He chose a fresh dataset, one connected to regional school funding disparities and their correlation with student discipline rates. He designed a model that not only mapped financial inputs to academic outcomes, but also cross-referenced it with suspension frequencies by race. The patterns were damning, elegant, and mathematically bulletproof. He formatted the graphs, annotated every assumption, and included an ethics section on statistical bias in educational policy. It was a masterwork, not because of its complexity, but because it translated real-world injustice into readable, undeniable evidence. This was what he wanted to present, not vending machine habits, not citations, but he knew better than to fight. So in class, he stayed quiet. He emailed them his citation page. He nodded during presentations and sat through meetings where decisions were made without his input. He learned how silence worked, not as absence but as armor. 2 days before the submission deadline, Keon uploaded his own full project draft to their shared folder, not as a replacement, but as a suggestion. He included notes, a rationale, and offered to walk them through the findings. The document was polished, professional, and ready for competition-level presentation, but none of them replied. The next morning, the final draft was due. As Keon entered room 304, his steps slowed. Something in the air had shifted again, not dramatically, but perceptibly. His group sat near the front, huddled close, their laptops open. They barely acknowledged him. On the projector screen, the submission portal displayed a confirmation message. The final project had already been uploaded. Keon opened his laptop. His heart sank. The document they submitted was entirely theirs. Vending machine analysis, basic linear regression, and minimal modeling. His name appeared on the title page, but none of his work, not a single sentence, graph, or citation, was included. His entire model had been erased, quietly, strategically. They had used him as a placeholder. When the bell rang, Mr. Halburst began the class without missing a beat. He complimented the teams for their collaborative spirit and explained that presentations would begin the following week. Keon sat motionless, his mind spinning. The others had stolen credit by omission, a theft that couldn't be proven, but couldn't be denied. He felt a familiar sensation, not anger but clarity. This wasn't about one project. This was about narrative, about control. The erasure was systemic, in the grading, the grouping, the classroom culture. What they feared wasn't his voice. It was the proof that he could outperform them in their own system. And they had silenced him before he could speak. But Keon had learned something in his basement lab that no one in that room knew yet. He didn't need a team. He didn't need permission. He only needed a platform and timing. And just as he started packing his bag, his phone vibrated with a notification. He opened it. An anonymous message had arrived, sent from a burner school email address. It read, "You should see what they said about you in their group chat." Attached was a screenshot. Keon's eyes locked onto the image. A group message thread, with his teammates laughing, mocking his project, and calling him the citation boy, who tries too hard to be white smart. And just below it, one final line, "He's gonna be shocked when he sees we deleted everything he did." The glow of the projector cast a faint blue tint across the room. As the first slide flickered onto the screen, It was presentation day in room 304, and tension pulsed beneath the surface like static. Students shuffled nervously, adjusting ties, smoothing hair, flipping note cards with false confidence. This was the mid-semester milestone, the statistics project every student at Hamilton Ridge remembered long after graduation. Keon sat at the edge of his group's row, notebook closed, hands clasped tightly. His eyes weren't on the screen, they were on the people seated beside him. His teammates, the ones who had laughed at him in secret messages, deleted his work in silence, and erased him in every way they could without speaking his name. Their voices were low, rehearsing lines one last time. Their energy was frenetic but forced, like actors waiting for a curtain to rise on a play they never fully learned. They hadn't acknowledged Keon all morning. Not in the hallway, not during setup, but their avoidance wasn't indifference anymore. It was fear masquerading as arrogance. They knew what they had done. Mr. Halberst stood at the back, clipboard in hand, his posture relaxed but eyes alert. He didn't glance at Keon once. His presence felt like a shadow, not leading the room, but watching it for deviation. The group's presentation began with a stumble. The title slide appeared. Consumption Trends in School Vending Machines, a Predictive Analysis. One of the students, a tall boy with thin glasses, stepped forward and launched into an introduction so generic it could have been copied from a nutrition pamphlet. He spoke quickly, nervously, mispronouncing variables, rushing through the research question without framing its significance. The next student fared no better, fumbling the explanation of the model inputs, confusing correlation with causation. The data tables appeared, disorganized, misaligned, no labels on the axes, no confidence intervals. The class began to shift in their seats. Eyes darted toward one another. A few whispered behind sleeves. One student stifled a laugh when a slide froze mid-transition, revealing an Excel error code. Keon remained still. Then came the regression slide, the heart of their analysis. It was supposed to show how product placement and pricing influenced snack consumption trends over time. But the formula was wrong. The R-squared value contradicted the conclusion. They had used a linear model for a non-linear dataset. Worse, they had misidentified a categorical variable as continuous. The projection was junk. One teammate looked visibly panicked, eyes scanning the room for help. Another tapped the keyboard too hard, as if force would fix the math. Silence fell. And then movement. Keon stood up. The motion was calm, controlled, unannounced. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for anyone to notice. He walked from the edge of the row to the front of the room, past his groupmates, and faced the class. No one stopped him. Not even Mr. Halberst. In a room where he had once been told he wasn't built for this kind of thinking, Keon stood in front of the whiteboard with nothing but his memory, his mastery, and the quiet fire that had fueled every midnight lesson in that basement. He didn't speak to prove a point. He spoke to reveal the truth. He explained, calmly and precisely, the statistical flaws in the model. He pointed out how the misclassified variables skewed the regression line, how multicollinearity weakened the results, and how their conclusions lacked significance. He then pivoted seamlessly into the alternative model he had built. The air changed. No slides, no fancy transitions, just raw clarity. Keon reconstructed the analysis in real time on the board, drawing diagrams from memory, reciting formulas, identifying control variables, and offering a revised projection with predicted confidence intervals. He referenced sources the class hadn't seen before, government data, peer-reviewed journals, and real-world applications. He contextualized the vending machine trends, not just as snack habits, but as economic behavior, layered with psychological variables, like choice fatigue and price anchoring. He translated complex math into meaning, and the room leaned in. One student, the same girl who had looked away weeks earlier, now followed every word. Another nudged their partner, whispering something with eyebrows raised. The silence had shifted from awkwardness to awe. Even the projector, now dimmed by inactivity, seemed irrelevant. Mr. Halberst said nothing. His clipboard remained at his side, untouched. Keon finished by drawing a clean visual representation of his model's outputs, annotated with key takeaways. There was no theatrics, no self-congratulation, just quiet, undeniable precision. Then he stepped back, erased his name from the original project title on the board, and simply wrote, Revised Model Predictive Consumption Framework, Matthews 2020. No one clapped. Not immediately, because the room wasn't ready. They were still processing what had just happened, that the boy they dismissed had just rewritten the assignment, dismantled their assumptions, and reclaimed the space they tried to deny him. But recognition came in the form of silence. The good kind. The kind that means something real had just happened. And when Keon returned to his seat, he didn't look at his group. He didn't have to. They were already looking at him. Shaken. Exposed. The rest of the class struggled to follow. Subsequent presentations, though decent, felt pale in comparison. Their content might have been strong, but their delivery lacked the electricity of Keon's clarity, the unexpected audacity of a student rising mid-failure to save the very assignment that had tried to bury him. Mr. Halberst finally spoke near the end of class, offering brief comments on the group presentations. He praised the effort of several teams, made vague suggestions for improvement, but never once mentioned Keon by name. It was as if the board had wiped him away along with the chalk. But Keon didn't need affirmation from that direction. Because as the bell rang and students began packing up, something unusual happened. The door at the back of the classroom opened. In stepped Principal Malden, a woman rarely seen outside assemblies or emergencies. Her heels echoed lightly as she crossed the room, her face composed but alert. She smiled politely at the class, then looked toward Mr. Halberst with quiet intent, and then her eyes settled on Keon. She thanked the class for their hard work, acknowledged the importance of analytical thinking in modern education, and then casually but clearly asked one student to stay behind. Keon. The room paused mid-motion. His groupmates froze. A few students exchanged glances. Even Mr. Halberst blinked. Keon nodded silently, remaining in his seat as the rest of the class filtered out around him. He had no idea what the principal wanted, but he had a feeling it wasn't about vending machines. As the door closes and Principal Malden takes the seat beside Keon, she places a manila folder on the desk, one marked with the school district seal and labeled Confidential Student Grading Audit. The folder sat unopened for a long moment, its presence enough to thicken the air between Keon and Principal Malden. Sunlight filtered in through the narrow classroom window, catching flecks of dust as they hovered silently in the room. The words printed on the cover, Confidential Student Grading Audit, Room 304, weren't just official. They were surgical, sharp enough to dissect the quiet injustices no one had dared put in writing. Keon kept his gaze steady, his hands flat against the desk, even as a cold awareness settled in his chest. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the system he had accidentally exposed. Principal Malden's demeanor was calm but deliberate. She explained that in light of the semester's project presentations, a few discrepancies in grading had been flagged. While she didn't go into detail, her words hinted at something deeper, an internal review that had begun quietly and might unravel more than anyone expected. She commended Keon on his poise, his analytical clarity, and without saying it outright, his ability to keep his composure when everything around him had tried to erase him. Then, just as he thought the conversation might end, she slid another paper across the desk. It was a program proposal, an initiative aimed at launching a peer tutoring network for students struggling in advanced STEM courses. It wasn't mandatory, nor was it funded, but it was endorsed by the administration, and she wanted Keon to lead it. The offer landed like thunder behind his ribs. For the first time, his intelligence wasn't just recognized, it was invited to lead. Not by peers who excluded him, not by a teacher who belittled him, but by the school itself. It was a subtle shift, but a monumental one. Acceptance by power, not just proximity. Keon said yes with a nod. Nothing loud, nothing performative, just a quiet agreement with history. Over the next week, things changed. Keon was given a small corner table in the library during third period, where students could sign up for one-on-one tutoring in statistics, algebra, or calculus. At first, no one came, but word spread, quietly. Then quickly, a few students who had watched his presentation approached with questions under the guise of casual conversation. Then came actual sign-ups, names on the list, questions scribbled on note cards, and students sitting down across from him, without irony, ready to learn. Keon didn't brag. He didn't carry himself differently. He simply taught, and he was good at it. Better than some teachers, even. He understood what confusion looked like, the subtle furrow in a brow, the fake nod that masked a lack of understanding. He could decode silence better than most people could parse words, maybe because he'd lived so long in the kind of silence that meant survival. His basement notes became a curriculum. His blackboard formulas, now digitized, became handouts. And slowly, what started as a table became a movement. The principal took notice. The guidance counselor began recommending students. A few teachers offered verbal support, if only to distance themselves from the storm brewing around Mr. Halberst. But with visibility came new danger. The whisper campaign began before the end of the second week. Keon heard the edges of it, in hallways, between locker doors, and chemistry lectures. Quiet words, casually thrown. He got outside help, or his mom probably hired a tutor, or he hacked the project folder. A rumor spread that he had faked the dataset, another that Principal Malden had a soft spot for certain types of students. The code was never direct, but Keon had lived long enough to understand when racism dressed itself in plausible deniability. Some students stopped signing up for tutoring, others hesitated when walking past his desk. Even those who respected him stayed silent when others joked nearby. The same classroom that once ignored him, now talked about him, but never to him. And in a place like Hamilton Ridge, silence wasn't neutrality, it was complicity. Keon didn't push back. He continued showing up on time, prepared, composed. He answered questions with calm precision. Even when students tested him with questions outside the curriculum, he pretended not to notice when one peer accidentally knocked over his binder, scattering notes across the floor. He didn't flinch when a teacher subtly asked if the tutoring was taking away from his own studies. He had learned by now. They weren't testing his knowledge. They were testing his right to exist with authority. He walked the halls differently now, not with swagger but with purpose. His head wasn't bowed. His steps weren't hurried. He didn't try to make himself small. He was no longer invisible, and that unsettled people who had once enjoyed his silence. It wasn't just that he had succeeded. It was that he had succeeded without their permission. But what began as whispers soon turned more vicious. One afternoon, after tutoring 3 students back to back, Keon returned to his locker between periods. His mind was already racing with lesson plans, test prep, and the statistical model he was building on community nutrition patterns. His hand reached for the lock, twisting it mechanically. Then he saw it. A folded note, wedged deep into the metal vent. The paper was plain. No name, no handwriting on the outside. Just a rectangle of white, thinly creased, sitting like a trap that had already been sprung. He unfolded it slowly. The words inside weren't long. Just one sentence, written in thick, angry marker strokes that bled slightly into the paper fibers. "You're not fooling anyone, monkey." The letters screamed silently from the page. No signature, no hint, just violence made linguistic, carved into his sense of safety like a wound. Keon didn't move. Not at first. The hallway bustled around him. Students laughing, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking on waxed floors. But his world narrowed to a pinpoint. Every sound became muffled. Every breath thickened. He read it again, and again. The paper didn't shake in his hand. He wouldn't give it that. But something inside him shifted. Not broke. He had no space left for breaking, but hardened, like steel forged hotter. This wasn't just a threat. It was confirmation. They saw him now, and some of them hated that he wouldn't disappear. As Keon crumples the note into his pocket, a voice behind him calls his name. He turns slowly, and sees Mr. Halberst standing there, holding a printout of Keon's latest tutoring worksheet, his expression unreadable. Keon stood face to face with Mr. Halberst, the words from the locker note still ringing in the back of his mind like an unshakable echo. The teacher's face revealed nothing. No hostility, no warmth, just that calculated neutrality he had perfected long before Keon had ever stepped into room 3. In his hand, the printout of Keon's tutoring worksheet flapped slightly under the force of the hallway's circulating air. The title at the top read, "Intro to Regression Logic for Predictive Modeling," a concept usually reserved for second-year college students, not high schoolers. There was no confrontation, no accusation. Mr. Halberst offered a subtle nod before walking past him, slow and measured, like a ghost that left the chill of winter behind. Keon didn't look back. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered, not with words but presence. The note, the timing, the glance. It wasn't a conversation. It was surveillance. By the time Keon reached his next class, something in him felt rearranged. The locker incident hadn't been a one-time act of cowardice. It had been a signal, and just hours later, that signal exploded across a different battlefield. It began with a notification. A new Instagram account had tagged him. At first glance it looked like a joke page. One of those anonymous student confession profiles that floated around every high school like digital graffiti. But when Keon clicked the handle, his stomach dropped. The page was named "I, the Real Citation Boy." Its bio read, Keon Matthews, the smartest fraud on campus. Dozens of manipulated images filled the feed. Some were screenshots of his tutoring handouts, covered in red scribbles and sarcastic captions accusing him of plagiarism. Others were photos of Keon himself, taken without his knowledge, in the cafeteria, in the hallway, at his library desk, edited with cartoonish glasses, monkey emojis, or captions mocking his expression. One image had the words "token tutor" photoshopped across his chest in bold letters. The comments were worse, laced with sarcasm, thinly veiled slurs, and just enough plausible deniability to survive moderation. Some claimed he only got the tutor job to fill a quota. Others questioned how a black student could possibly teach AP content better than the actual teacher. A few said the quiet part out loud, calling him a cheat, a joke, a wannabe who'd get put back in his place soon. Keon sat frozen in his room that night, the glow of his phone illuminating a face that refused to show the fracture forming beneath it. He scrolled for hours, each post landing like a stone. The confidence he'd built, layer by careful layer, now felt like glass beneath the weight of mockery. Every like, every repost, every silence from someone he once helped, it all chipped away at the illusion of safety. This wasn't just online bullying. It was a campaign, coordinated, cruel, targeted. And it was working. By the end of the week, 2 students withdrew their tutoring appointments. One claimed they didn't want to be involved in drama. Another told the guidance counselor they felt uncomfortable working with Keon, given recent allegations online. No one asked if the posts were true. No one investigated the source. They simply distanced themselves, as if his brilliance had become radioactive. Even the administration, once eager to support his rise, grew quiet. Principal Malden didn't pull him aside again. Teachers who once nodded in passing now looked through him. And Mr. Halberst, always carefully detached, never mentioned the Instagram account. He didn't need to. The silence was permission. At home, Keon tried to hold it together. His mother noticed the change, the tighter shoulders, the longer hours spent in silence, the haunted look behind his eyes. She didn't press. She waited, offering him the space to breathe, but staying close enough for him to reach. And finally, late one Sunday night, as he sat staring at a blank Google Doc where his next tutoring guide should have been, the silence cracked. He told her everything, not just about the posts, but about the project, the group erasure, the note in the locker, the hallway looks, the fake rumors, the digital mockery, all of it. And she listened, not with surprise but with the painful recognition of someone who had walked that path before. She told him about her own years in academia, how she'd once been the only black adjunct in a department full of men who never said her name aloud, but discussed her qualifications behind closed doors. She spoke about the cost of being brilliant, while black, the line between excellence and invisibility being one insult away from collapse. Then she handed him a folder. Inside were her old statistics teaching guides, ones she had written herself during community college lectures long before Keon had been born. They were handwritten, annotated, meticulous. The ink had faded, but the precision was still sharp. And just like that, Keon found his purpose again. Not in revenge. Not even in proving anyone wrong, but in legacy. He decided to build his own guide, not just worksheets, but an actual framework for students like him. A visual, conceptual, and statistical guide that broke down complex theories in ways no classroom dared to try. It wasn't just about AP stats anymore. It was about empowerment. He called it the silent curve, because that's what his journey had been. An invisible arc of growth forged in silence, built under pressure, and curving toward clarity. Each night, Keon worked on it in the basement. He drew on his mother's notes, layered in his own research, and tested every page for clarity and usefulness. It wasn't flashy, but it was functional. And as he designed, he imagined future students who looked like him, dismissed, doubted, disrespected, opening this guide and realizing they were never the problem. Slowly, he began distributing the early drafts to the students who still trusted him. The feedback was instant. It made sense. It clicked. They asked for more. Even a teacher from another department stopped by to ask if he'd be willing to help tutor a sophomore struggling with basic algebra. The tide hadn't turned, but something had begun to resist the current. Keon still faced stares, still passed whispers, still carried the digital weight of an online smear campaign designed to isolate him. But he had found a foothold again, and this time, it was rooted in something deeper than approval. He had built something real, and real couldn't be undone by lies. But the darkness hadn't retreated. It was only hiding. One Thursday evening, while editing the third section of The Silent Curve, Keon's phone buzzed with a new notification. It wasn't from Instagram. It came through an anonymous messaging app, often used by students to evade school filters. The message had no greeting, no context, just a single sentence, and it drained the air from the room as Keon read it over and over again, each time colder than the last. Mr. Halburst is coming for your tutoring program. The message sat on Keon's screen long after he'd read it. Mr. Halburst is coming for your tutoring program. 10 words, no sender, no timestamp, just dread distilled into plain text. He stared at it in silence, trying to parse the layers. Was it a warning, a threat, or both? He didn't know who sent it, but the timing was too precise to ignore. The recent online attacks, the sudden coldness from administration, the escalating tension in the hallways. Something was building, and now it had a name, Halburst. The next day, room 304 felt different, not louder or quieter, but charged, like the second before lightning strikes. Keon noticed it the moment he walked in. Mr. Halburst was already at his desk, uncharacteristically early, organizing papers with mechanical precision. His tie was tighter than usual, shirt tucked with obsessive crispness, like he was preparing for something ceremonial. His eyes didn't meet Keon's, but the stack of papers beside him drew Keon's attention immediately. The board didn't list the usual lesson plan. Instead, it simply read, Pop Quiz, Statistical Modeling and Analysis. Students murmured as they took their seats, confusion rippling across the room like a quiet tide. A quiz? On a Thursday, no warning, no review, just sudden evaluation. Halburst stood and with deliberate calm began distributing the packets. Keon watched the pages land on each desk. The title at the top was coldly official, Advanced Application Assessment, Individual Performance Only. When the paper landed in front of him, Keon already knew. This wasn't just a quiz. It was a test of something far more personal than knowledge. From the first question, the trap was obvious. These weren't standard AP-level problems. They weren't even from the textbook. The terminology was twisted, phrased in ways designed to confuse. One question referenced a model taught in graduate-level courses, content that had never been covered in class. Another was a case study that required reading between statistical lines, combining theory with real-world interpretation, something most students weren't trained to do. Keon didn't flinch. He recognized the tactics, shift the parameters, muddy the language, test not comprehension but compliance. It wasn't enough to challenge the class. This quiz was crafted to discredit him. Buried beneath its complex phrasing and skewed models was an attempt to make him hesitate, stumble, second-guess. But Halburst had underestimated something. Keon had already traveled through the fire. He'd rebuilt himself in a basement with nothing but chalk and grit. He had unraveled university-level models, pored over predictive analytics, and recreated entire frameworks from scratch. He'd seen real data weaponized, and he knew how to defend against it. One by one, he broke the questions apart, dissecting not only what was asked, but what was meant. He wrote clearly, annotating his assumptions, defining ambiguous terms where needed. He backed every answer with rational logic, even when the phrasing tried to trip him. He didn't rush, he didn't freeze. He treated each question like a minefield, and walked it with precision. Around him, the room was a chorus of sighs, pencil taps, and quiet dread. Students fumbled, erased, guessed. A few whispered complaints under their breath. It wasn't just Keon who noticed the irregularity. The quiz was clearly beyond anything they'd prepared for. Keon finished just as the bell rang. He closed his booklet, stacked it neatly, and walked to the front of the room, without a glance toward Halburst. The teacher accepted the quiz silently, his eyes flicking up for a split second, just enough to register something unreadable. Keon walked out without a word. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. But deep inside he knew what he had just done. He hadn't just passed a test. He had passed through a trap built to humiliate him, and dismantled it. The results were posted the following morning. Mr. Halburst had taped them to the classroom door, a tradition meant to foster transparency, though students knew it was really about public comparison. Keon approached with his usual calm, his eyes scanning the list. There it was. Matthews, Keon, 100%. The only perfect score, not just in his group, in the class. Gasps broke out behind him. A few students whispered. One muttered something about how the hell under their breath. Another audibly said, "No way." The rest were scattered scores, mostly in the 60s and 70s. A few high 80s, but only one stood at the top, unchallenged. Keon stepped into the classroom. This time he didn't sit near his group. He took a seat in the back, not to hide, but to observe. The eyes that had once passed through him now couldn't look away. Some avoided eye contact out of shame, others out of confusion. A few stared openly, as if trying to figure out how their version of reality had been broken in public. Mr. Halburst began class with an expression that bordered on forced neutrality. He congratulated the class, vaguely, mentioned how the quiz was meant to push boundaries. And then, almost too casually, he mentioned there had been one statistical outlier worth noting. He paused, then he said it. That one name, Keon. He called the score impressive, then added something else. Something no one expected. He said that in light of the difficulty level and the curve, such a score raised certain flags. A silence fell. Halburst continued, now walking toward the whiteboard, explaining that academic integrity was critical, that in certain rare cases, if a student's performance deviated too significantly from expectations, it warranted further review. He wrote the phrase "unusual performance variance" on the board, as if it were part of today's lesson. And then he turned to the class and said it plainly. That Keon Matthews's exam had been flagged for possible academic dishonesty. No proof, no hearing, no warning, just accusation, laid bare in front of his classmates. Keon didn't move. His chest rose and fell evenly, but inside, something went cold. He looked around the room and saw it happen in real time, the doubt returning to faces that had just begun to believe, the whispers starting again, the trust retracting like a tide. Halburst didn't stop there. He said an internal review would be conducted, that Keon would be asked to resit for a verification exam, alone, monitored, timed. He framed it as procedure, as fairness. But the subtext was clear. He didn't believe Keon was capable of what he'd done. And now he would try to make the world believe it too. Keon's name, once etched on the board in triumph, now hovered beneath a cloud of suspicion. And the worst part wasn't the accusation itself. It was how the room responded. Not with outrage, but with silence. Again, as Keon left the room in silence, he checked his email and found a message from the vice principal titled "Academic Hearing, Notice of Inquiry." Attached was a formal letter and a date for his disciplinary review. The message sat on Keon's screen long after he'd read it. "Mr. Halburst is coming for your tutoring program." 10 words. No sender. No timestamp. Just dread distilled into plain text. He stared at it in silence, trying to parse the layers. Was it a warning, a threat, or both? He didn't know who sent it, but the timing was too precise to ignore. The recent online attacks, the sudden coldness from administration, the escalating tension in the hallways. Something was building, and now it had a name: Halburst. The next day, room 304 felt different, not louder or quieter, but charged, like the second before lightning strikes. Keon noticed it the moment he walked in. Mr. Halburst was already at his desk, uncharacteristically early, organizing papers with mechanical precision. His tie was tighter than usual, shirt tucked with obsessive crispness, like he was preparing for something ceremonial. His eyes didn't meet Keon's, but the stack of papers beside him drew Keon's attention immediately. The board didn't list the usual lesson plan. Instead, it simply read, "Pop quiz, statistical modeling and analysis." Students murmured as they took their seats, confusion rippling across the room like a quiet tide. A quiz? On a Thursday? No warning. No review. Just sudden evaluation. Halburst stood and, with deliberate calm, began distributing the packets. Keon watched the pages land on each desk. The title at the top was coldly official: Advanced Application Assessment, Individual Performance Only. When the paper landed in front of him, Keon already knew. This wasn't just a quiz. It was a test of something far more personal than knowledge. From the first question, the trap was obvious. These weren't standard AP-level problems. They weren't even from the textbook. The terminology was twisted, phrased in ways designed to confuse. One question referenced a model taught in graduate-level courses. content that had never been covered in class. Another was a case study that required reading between statistical lines, combining theory with real-world interpretation, something most students weren't trained to do. Keon didn't flinch. He recognized the tactics. Shift the parameters, muddy the language, test not comprehension, but compliance. It wasn't enough to challenge the class. This quiz was crafted to discredit him. Buried beneath its complex phrasing and skewed models was an attempt to make him hesitate, stumble, second guess. But Halberst had underestimated something. Keon had already traveled through the fire. He'd rebuilt himself in a basement with nothing but chalk and grit. He had unraveled university-level models, pored over predictive analytics, and recreated entire frameworks from scratch. He'd seen real data weaponized, and he knew how to defend against it. One by one, he broke the questions apart, dissecting not only what was asked, but what was meant. He wrote clearly, annotating his assumptions, defining ambiguous terms where needed. He backed every answer with rational logic. Even when the phrasing tried to trip him, he didn't rush. He didn't freeze. He treated each question like a minefield, and walked it with precision. Around him, the room was a chorus of sighs, pencil taps, and quiet dread. Students fumbled, erased, guessed, a few whispered complaints, under their breath. It wasn't just Keon who noticed the irregularity. The quiz was clearly beyond anything they'd prepared for. Keon finished just as the bell rang. He closed his booklet, stacked it neatly, and walked to the front of the room without a glance, toward Halberst. The teacher accepted the quiz silently, his eyes flicking up for a split second, just enough to register something unreadable. Keon walked out without a word. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. But deep inside, he knew what he had just done. He hadn't just passed a test. He had passed through a trap built to humiliate him, and dismantled it. The results were posted the following morning. Mr. Halberst had taped them to the classroom door, a tradition meant to foster transparency, though students knew it was really about public comparison. Keon approached with his usual calm, his eyes scanning the list. There it was. Matthews, Keon, 100%. The only perfect score, not just in his group, in the class. Gasps broke out behind him. A few students whispered. One muttered something about how the hell under their breath. Another audibly said, "No way." The rest were scattered scores, mostly in the 60s and 70s. A few high 80s, but only one stood at the top, unchallenged. Keon stepped into the classroom. This time, he didn't sit near his group. He took a seat in the back, not to hide, but to observe. The eyes that had once passed through him now couldn't look away. Some avoided eye contact out of shame, others out of confusion. A few stared openly, as if trying to figure out how their version of reality had been broken in public. Mr. Halberst began class with an expression that bordered on forced neutrality. He congratulated the class, vaguely, mentioned how the quiz was meant to push boundaries. And then, almost too casually, he mentioned there had been one statistical outlier worth noting. He paused, then he said it. That one name, Keon. He called the score impressive, then added something else, something no one expected. He said that in light of the difficulty level and the curve, such a score raised certain flags. A silence fell. Halberst continued, now walking toward the whiteboard, explaining that academic integrity was critical, that in certain rare cases, if a student's performance deviated too significantly from expectations, it warranted further review. He wrote the phrase unusual performance variance on the board, as if it were part of today's lesson. And then he turned to the class and said it plainly, that Keon Matthews's exam had been flagged for possible academic dishonesty. No proof, no hearing, no warning, just accusation, laid bare in front of his classmates. Keon didn't move. His chest rose and fell evenly. But inside, something went cold. He looked around the room and saw it happen in real time, the doubt returning to faces that had just begun to believe. The whispers starting again, the trust retracting like a tide. Halberst didn't stop there. He said an internal review would be conducted, that Keon would be asked to resit for a verification exam, alone, monitored, timed. He framed it as procedure, as fairness, but the subtext was clear. He didn't believe Keon was capable of what he'd done, and now, he would try to make the world believe it too. Keon's name, once etched on the board in triumph, now hovered beneath a cloud of suspicion. And the worst part wasn't the accusation itself. It was how the room responded. Not with outrage, but with silence. Again, as Keon left the room in silence, he checked his email and found a message from the vice principal titled Academic Hearing, Notice of Inquiry. Attached was a formal letter and a date for his disciplinary review. 9. Disciplinary Hearing. When the System Doubts the Black Prodigy. 1420 words. The letter sat in Keon's inbox like a verdict waiting to be read. Academic Hearing. Notice of Inquiry. The subject line alone was enough to pierce the resolve he had spent months building. It was no longer about doubt, whispered behind lockers, or anonymous messages online. This was formal. This was institutional. The system had taken notice, and it had already begun to move against him. The next morning, Keon reported to the administrative wing of Hamilton Ridge, an area he had never stepped into before. The offices smelled sterile, like disinfectant and thick paper. The secretary at the front desk offered a clipped nod, barely making eye contact before directing him to conference room B. Inside, a long rectangular table awaited, surrounded by chairs that felt too large and walls that felt too narrow. 3 faculty members sat at one end: the vice principal, an assistant superintendent from the district, and the school's academic ethics coordinator, a woman Keon had only ever seen from afar during award ceremonies. There was no jury, no audience, just professionals and paperwork. Keon sat when prompted, his hands clasped in his lap, spine straight, face unreadable. They read the charge aloud: suspicion of academic dishonesty. No evidence had been presented against him. No complaints had been filed. The suspicion itself was enough to justify the inquiry. That was the rule. A rule designed to ensure fairness, but often weaponized against the wrong students, for the wrong reasons. He wasn't allowed a representative. No parent, no lawyer, just himself. Still, Keon had come prepared. He laid out a clear defense. First, his handwritten study logs, dating back months, annotated in the same red ink as his tutoring notes. Then screenshots of his online coursework, including timestamps of video lectures he had completed. Quizzes passed, models replicating. He presented footage from his tutoring sessions, hours of him breaking down statistical concepts for other students. Unprompted, fluid, accurate. He even showed a folder of worksheets he had created from scratch, featuring similar problems to the ones on the exam, all documented long before the test was given. His voice remained calm throughout. He didn't beg for understanding. He explained, logically, methodically, the same way he approached a dataset. Patient, precise, unflinching. But as he spoke, he noticed it. The way the committee glanced between one another with measured caution. How their pens paused over forms but never filled them in. The way they listened, not to verify his truth, but to search for cracks in his certainty. It wasn't disbelief exactly. It was something colder. Something administrative. The same tone bureaucracies adopted when they knew injustice wasn't a flaw in the system. It was a feature. After nearly an hour, the room fell quiet. The vice principal cleared her throat and thanked Keon for his detailed presentation. Then she said the words he would never forget. Due to the unusual nature of the results, and the potential impact on the integrity of the academic environment, your case will remain under review. Under review. Not resolved. Not cleared. Just suspended in limbo. A shadow of suspicion that would follow him like an invisible scar. But that wasn't all. Until the matter was settled, Keon would be barred from participating in any peer tutoring activities. Effective immediately, it felt less like punishment and more like erasure. They weren't taking away his grades. They were taking away his purpose. The tutoring desk in the library would sit empty. The guide he'd built, the silent curve, would be shelved indefinitely. And with it, the proof of his value would vanish. Not because he failed, but because the system had made it impossible to succeed without permission. Keon stood, gathered his materials without expression, and walked out of the room. Not a single person offered him a parting word. The hallway outside was too quiet, too bright. The noise of passing students felt distant, like another universe moving past him. He walked slowly, not because he was weak, but because he was thinking, calculating, adjusting. This wasn't a fall. This was a pivot. Back in the main hallway, students passed him with sideways glances. Some looked curious. Others kept their eyes low. A few walked faster when they saw him coming. The rumors had already spread. His name was back in their mouths. Not for excellence, but for controversy. By lunchtime, the whispers had turned into questions. Some said he'd been caught cheating. Others said the district was investigating him for hacking the grading system. A few whispered about fabricated worksheets and impossible scores. It didn't matter that none of it was true. The accusation was enough. At his locker, Keon stood in silence, staring into the hollow metal space that had become a second battlefield. He expected another note, another slur, another message telling him he didn't belong. But this time, there was nothing inside, just the emptiness he was meant to feel. He closed it and turned, and that's when he saw him. Tyler Jensen, a white student from his AP statistics class. One who had laughed when Keon's hand was ignored in class, who had scoffed during the vending machine project, who had reposted one of the fake Instagram stories with a laughing emoji. He wasn't a ringleader, but he was complicit, loud in mockery, silent in truth. Now he stood alone, hands in the pocket of his hoodie, gaze not quite direct but not avoiding Keon either. His usual smirk was absent. Without speaking, Tyler reached into his backpack and pulled out a small USB flash drive. It was black, unmarked, plain. He extended it toward Keon. Keon didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he accepted it, their fingers never touching. Tyler looked around once, then leaned slightly closer and said something low, just loud enough to hear. Keon's eyes narrowed as he processed it. He didn't ask questions. He didn't speak. He simply watched Tyler walk away, not fast, not slow, just steady, like someone trying to outrun the echo of a decision they should have made earlier. Keon stood in the hallway, the USB drive now burning in his palm. Whatever was on it wasn't meant to exist, but someone had kept it, and now they'd given it to him. Keon rushes to the computer lab, plugs in the drive, and finds audio files labeled by date. The folder title reads, Room 304, Recordings, and the first file begins with Mr. Halberst's voice saying, "Let me explain why some students just don't get it, especially the black ones." The computer lab was nearly empty. The hum of old desktop towers, filling the room with a low mechanical rhythm. Keon moved like a shadow, slipping through rows of idle screens, until he reached the corner station, farthest from the door, obscured from the hallway. He slid into the chair, heart steady but heavy, and plugged the USB drive into the tower. For a second, nothing happened. Then a single folder appeared on the screen. Room 304, Recordings. No password, no encryption, just vulnerability disguised in simplicity. He clicked. Inside were over 60 audio files, each named by date, stretching back nearly 2 years. The earliest ones were months before Keon had even transferred to Hamilton Ridge. The latest was just 3 weeks ago. Every file began with the same prefix, RH304, followed by the date. It wasn't a random collection. It was a timeline. Keon clicked on the first. The recording crackled to life with background chatter. Desks shifting, paper rustling, someone laughing softly. Then the voice cut through. Unmistakable, smooth, and lined with false patience. Mr. Hilbert. He wasn't teaching. He was talking to another teacher, maybe between classes. The voice was quieter, but clear enough. He spoke about a student, a girl named Maya, describing her as sharp, but entitled, then added, with a laugh, that it's always the black girls who think the rules bend for them. Keon's stomach tightened. He clicked another. This one caught mid-lecture. A student, likely confused, had asked a question about conditional probability. Mr. Halberst replied with an exaggerated sigh, followed by a statement that chilled Keon. "It's basic algebra, guys. Some of you were never taught properly. I get that, especially the ones from the inner city. But this is high school now." Another click, and another. Each recording unearthed a new layer of venom, wrapped in the dry language of pedagogy. Casual racism laced with intellectual superiority. Comments about those kids who get free lunch and still expect an A, or how certain students inflate the achievement gap because they don't know when they're out of their league. The venom wasn't in the tone, it was in the frequency. This wasn't accidental, it was habitual, practice. But the most damning were the recordings from the past 6 months. That's when the pattern changed. The tone sharpened. Keon's name started to appear. At first, brief, dismissive. Matthews is bright but cocky. He's trying too hard to impress. He doesn't know the difference between memorization and mastery. But as time progressed, the dismissals darkened. He's dangerous. The kind who turns people against the curriculum because he wants to be the exception. I'm watching him. Closely. I can't let one overachiever rewrite the standard. Keon froze. That wasn't just bias. That was premeditation. He skipped to the most recent recording, dated just 3 days before the sabotage quiz. In this one, Halberst spoke on a call perhaps with another faculty member, musing about raising the rigor in the classroom. He claimed some students were performing outside their proven range, and added that statistical anomalies don't happen without interference. Then, almost casually, he said, "I'll take care of it before the board hears anything." The implications were suffocating. Halberst wasn't just passively biased. He was actively crafting an environment designed to discredit black students, to push them toward failure, to keep control. The sabotage quiz wasn't spontaneous. It was a calculated move in a pattern that had repeated itself for years, hidden beneath the polished veneer of professionalism. Keon sat back, the hum of the computer now loud in his ears. He hadn't just uncovered a collection of inappropriate comments. He had found evidence of systemic targeting. A teacher leveraging his power to maintain a classroom culture of exclusion. The recordings were explosive, enough to justify suspension, maybe even termination, but also dangerous. Keon knew what this meant. If he went public, the story would spread like wildfire. Students would rally. The media would latch on. The district would be forced to act. But so would the backlash. He imagined the headlines. Not the ones about Halberst. The ones about him. The boy who brought down a decorated teacher. The angry black student. Who overreacted. The accusations that he fabricated the audio. That he was on a witch hunt. He had seen it happen before. In other cities. Other schools. Truth didn't always lead to justice. Sometimes it led to isolation. As he sat there, the USB drive still blinking in the tower, the computer lab door opened. Tyler, the same classmate who had given him the drive. He didn't speak. He just looked at Keon, eyes tight with something between guilt and warning. There was no apology in his posture, just the weight of someone who had seen what went too far and couldn't walk away from it. Keon stood. They didn't need words. But as he passed Tyler, something shifted. Tyler finally spoke, voice low, barely above a whisper. He said he used to think Keon was arrogant, that he made the class uncomfortable because he was too confident, too unshakable, But then Tyler had listened to the recordings. All of them. He had recognized the tone, the pattern, because it wasn't just Keon. Others had been targeted before. They'd just left, transferred out, or learned to stay quiet. Keon hadn't, and that scared them. Tyler paused, eyes glancing toward the hallway beyond the lab door. Then he said the last line, the one that landed like a trapdoor opening beneath Keon's feet. "If you leak this, your life here is over." Keon sat alone in his bedroom, the blue glow of the monitor painting shadows across his face. The USB drive rested beside his keyboard like a loaded trigger, heavy with the weight of everything it contained. Every file he had heard, every slur veiled in civility, every pattern of punishment masked as policy, it all burned beneath his skin. Tyler's warning echoed in his mind. If you leak this, your life here is over. It hadn't sounded like a threat. It was more like a reality check, and it was right. But for Keon, silence now felt like complicity. He didn't want revenge, and he didn't crave the spotlight. What he wanted, what he needed, was to finally break the algorithm of racism that repeated itself behind the polished halls and professional tones of Hamilton Ridge. And now he had the data, verifiable, raw, undeniable, not emotion, not anecdote, but evidence. That night, Keon launched a private website using an anonymous domain. He used encrypted servers, masked his IP, and uploaded 15 carefully selected audio files, the clearest and most damning clips. Each file came with a transcript and timestamp. More than that, he created a visual timeline of events. His first day in room 304, the project sabotage, the anonymous locker note, the pop quiz, the hearing. He didn't just upload files, he structured a story, one that the world would be forced to listen to. He titled the site with quiet precision, The Pattern, and then, without ceremony, he clicked publish. He didn't promote the site, not directly. He shared the link in a private Discord forum used by academic competitors. Then it reached a group chat. Then a private thread of students who had already whispered about Halberst's classroom before. Within 3 hours, the link had jumped across school social circles. By morning, it had gone viral inside Hamilton Ridge. The hashtag appeared first, Room 304 recordings. Screenshots of the site flooded Instagram stories. Students who had never spoken to Keon before now hovered in hallways listening to audio clips through earbuds. Some stood frozen at their lockers, eyes wide as they listened to Halberst's voice. Smug, casual, undeniably racist. One file played on loop in the cafeteria where he casually referenced urban kids who get confused by normal pace. Another had him joking that some students come to AP Stats thinking math will change their fate. No one needed context. The audio was the context. By lunchtime, the local news caught wind of it. A regional anchor played snippets of the audio over blurred transcripts. Reporters referenced an explosive anonymous leak, exposing bias in a top Georgia high school. That afternoon, the student population at Hamilton Ridge split into 3 quiet camps: those in shock, those in denial, and those who finally felt seen. For the first time, Keon wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one who had felt the chill behind Mr. Halber's politeness. But now, the proof had forced others to feel it too. By the second day, the site had reached over 100,000 views. The superintendent issued a statement acknowledging a review of troubling materials. But it was already too late. The silence that had protected Mr. Halberst for years had cracked, and through that fracture came stories from students long gone. Alumni who had transferred early, dropped AP courses, or simply faded out. Their posts poured in under the same hashtag. One wrote about how Halberst once corrected her pronunciation mid-answer in front of the entire class, then laughed. Another recalled how he always smiled when assigning the lowest scores to the same few kids. Kids who didn't look like the rest of the room. The school tried to maintain control, but the narrative was too loud, too detailed, too real. The tipping point came on day 3. Without warning, Hamilton Ridge suspended all AP statistics classes indefinitely. A morning PA announcement declared that curriculum integrity was under review. Students were pulled from class for surveys. Guidance counselors scheduled sudden one-on-ones. Reporters set up outside the front gate. 2 news vans parked near the faculty lot. Parents came early to pick up students. Some walked the halls angry, others embarrassed. Teachers, once proud of the school's ranking, now avoided eye contact, passing each other like strangers. Principal Malden called for an all-staff emergency meeting, and though Keon was never mentioned directly, everyone knew whose name was sealed behind that silence. Then, the inevitable came. That afternoon, Principal Malden's voice echoed over the intercom. Calm, composed. She stated that Mr. Arthur Halberst had officially submitted his resignation, effective immediately. No tribute, no thank you, just departure. The man who once ruled room 304 with quiet precision had exited through the side door of history. There was no applause, no celebration, just stunned silence. For Keon, seated in the back row of what had once been Halberst's classroom, it felt less like victory and more like aftermath. Justice never felt as satisfying as the stories promised. Sometimes it just left you standing in the wreckage, wondering what comes next. But the moment didn't linger. That evening, a new email arrived, sent to Keon's mother. Attached was a scanned letter, a legal document. The sender, Arthur Halberst's private legal counsel. Though resigned, Halberst wasn't retreating quietly. He had filed a defamation complaint, a formal accusation of character damage, alleging malicious misrepresentation, intentional harm, and unlawful publication of unauthorized recordings. The lawsuit was vague. It never mentioned Keon by name, but it cited the timeline, the website, and the events in perfect correlation to his known journey. It was code, clear enough to deliver the message. Keon read the document in silence, his mother watching across the table. The air between them was heavy, but steady. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. Instead, she reached for the letter, read it herself, then placed it flat on the table like a challenge. Keon knew what this meant. This was the second phase of injustice, the retaliation. They couldn't prove he cheated. So now they'd try to make him regret telling the truth. Not just through whispers, but through courts, through intimidation, through slow, deliberate pressure designed to wear him down. Keon leaned back, the corners of his mouth neither rising nor falling. He had told the truth with evidence, the kind of evidence no one could dispute, and because of that, they were trying to break him another way. But this time he wasn't standing in a classroom alone. He had the proof. And now, he had the world watching. Then, just as he set the letter aside, his phone buzzed on the table. A message from an unknown number. No name, no context, just one line. Check your locker. They know it was you.
The morning after the text, Keon stood at his locker, his fingers hesitating just above the combination lock. A cold knot tightened in his stomach as the echo of the message haunted him. Check your locker. They know it was you. His breath was steady, but his heartbeat felt like percussion behind his ribs. With one twist, the locker creaked open.
Inside, neatly taped to the door, was a printed article. The headline read, "Anonymous student behind viral leak identified." There was no byline, no photo, just a one-page spread. Clearly student-made, but disturbingly thorough. The article connected dots, listed event timelines, pulled from Keon's known schedule, and pointed to inconsistencies in his academic review process. It was clear, whoever wrote it had one goal: to name him. Below the headline, circled in red ink, was a phrase in block letters: "This kid ruined a man's life." Keon didn't tear it down. He didn't crumple it or react. He folded it carefully and walked to class, because something bigger now loomed beyond the halls of Hamilton Ridge. The lawsuit wasn't just a legal tactic, it was a public performance, a last grasp at control, and soon it would become national news. Within days, Keon's identity was no longer rumor. News outlets picked up the story. Some painted him as a whistleblower. Others questioned the ethics of student-led recordings. Comment sections exploded with arguments about race, education, and authority. Pundits debated whether a teenager should have the power to bring down a veteran teacher. Keon at 17 became both hero and lightning rod. Yet even as national interviews flooded his inbox, even as a college prep coach offered free SAT tutoring and journalists reached out with questions, Keon felt a loneliness that only clarity could create. Everyone was talking about him, but very few were listening to him. That changed the day his mother received a phone call from a legal nonprofit in Atlanta. A team of pro bono attorneys, all of them civil rights specialists, had read about Keon's case. They wanted to represent him, not just in defense, but in counterclaim. They believed he had grounds to file a motion for academic retaliation and emotional distress. More importantly, they believed in his evidence. By the time the first hearing arrived, Keon had already missed 3 days of class and postponed 2 interviews. His SAT prep book sat unread on his desk. His tutoring program remained suspended. But he showed up to court wearing a navy suit, borrowed from his cousin, a black tie his mother had ironed twice, and the quiet confidence of someone who'd already won battles in silence. The courtroom wasn't what he expected. No wooden theatrics, no dramatic gavel drops, just fluorescent lights, uncomfortable chairs, and the sterile chill of bureaucracy. Mr. Halberst sat across the aisle, surrounded by his legal team, polished, prepared, emotionless. He never once looked at Keon. The case was simple on paper: defamation versus whistleblowing. But the heart of it was more complex. It was about who was believed, who was protected, and who was allowed to tell the truth out loud. The attorneys began with procedural framing, laying out the origin of the audio files. They explained the context: a classroom plagued by consistent, targeted microaggressions, backed by recordings that no one had yet disputed. They played key excerpts from the files, each one more damning than the last. In one, Halberst explicitly questioned whether students from low-income black communities should be allowed in accelerated programs without cultural prep. In another, he dismissed concerns about grading fairness as noise from kids who don't belong in the room. But it was Keon's presentation that changed the tone of the courtroom. At his lawyer's request, he took the stand, not to argue emotion, but to present data. He brought with him a printed report, 20 pages of statistical analysis compiled independently in the weeks after the lawsuit was filed. It was clean, sourced, and mathematically sound. The title at the top of the report read, "Academic Bias and Statistical Disparity in Hamilton Ridge High School's AP Program." Keon had run regressions, comparing grading trends across 3 years in AP statistics. He had normalized for variables, attendance, GPA, testing history, and the results were clear. Students of color, particularly black students, received significantly lower participation and project scores on average than their white peers. Even when performance metrics aligned, the anomalies weren't random. They formed a pattern Halberst couldn't explain. Even the opposing attorney, seasoned and precise, struggled to poke holes in the logic. The data spoke louder than any allegation could. This wasn't personal, this was structural. And when asked why he had uploaded the audio, Keon answered with unshaken clarity: because no one listens to silence, and because truth isn't defamation, it's accountability. The judge didn't render an immediate verdict, but the direction of the case shifted visibly. Halberst's team requested time to consider a settlement. Public pressure mounted by the hour. And by the end of the week, the district attorney's office announced a full investigation into the AP department at Hamilton Ridge. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Students, journalists, activists. Some held signs with Keon's name. Others held up phones, capturing the moment. Keon walked out with his mother beside him. Not smiling, not waving, just present, just grounded. That night, as the city calmed and the internet churned with headlines, a quiet moment unfolded hundreds of miles away. In a university office lined with research books and algorithm charts, the chair of a prestigious statistics department sat with a tablet in hand, rewatching a courtroom clip of Keon's testimony. Not the lawyers, not the audio, just Keon, poised, articulate, dissecting bias with the same elegance most professors took years to master. The chair leaned back, eyes narrowing with curiosity. Then, with no hesitation, he picked up the phone and made a call. On the other end of that call, a university admissions director listens carefully and adds Keon Matthews' name to a short, exclusive list labeled Priority Full Ride Consideration. Keon Matthews stepped onto the polished auditorium floor at Midtown University just after sunrise. The giant hall, once intimidating in promotional photos, felt alive now, vibrating with the quiet shuffles of college students arriving, chairs clicking into place, laptops opening, and coffee cups being set on long seminar tables. The sunlight streamed through tall windows along the side walls, casting long, pale reflections across the gleaming wood floor. For a moment, Keon hesitated at the edge of the stage, the weight of the moment settling over him. He was 17, black, and standing before a room full of people who had doubted him, judged him, or ignored him, and now, in this institution's spotlight, he was the expert. His invitation had come just days after the courtroom verdict. A formal letter from the chair of the statistics department, praising his analytical clarity, his courage, and the potential his findings held for academic discourse. The department wanted him to deliver a guest lecture titled Bias, Data and the Hidden Curves, a black student's journey through statistics. It was part of the university's initiative for social justice in STEM. For Keon, accepting the invitation felt less like prestige and more like responsibility, a chance to transform what had once been pain into power. As the auditorium filled, Keon noticed small groups gathering at the front, professors in tweed jackets discussing quietly, older graduate students swapping notebooks, and undergraduates leaning forward in their seats, curiosity bright in their eyes. Some faces were skeptical, others friendly, but all were watching with expectation. Keon tightened the strap of his backpack on his shoulder and walked slowly to the podium, each footstep echoing softly in the hush. In that echo he heard all the doubts, the whispered warnings, the notes left in lockers, the erased data, the accusations, and now in the quiet before his voice rose, he felt poised to reclaim every inch of the classroom, this one, and every one that followed. He opened his laptop, the screen bright against the dim stage lights. The first slide glowed, a simple black background with clean white text, statistical equity. When data exposes bias, without theatrics, without grand entrance, just presence. The room leaned in. Keon scrolled and began his lecture, not in nervy student tone, but in calm authority. He walked them through his journey, from the raw data he discovered in that public portal, the discriminatory grading trends he uncovered across years, the statistical models he built in his basement, the courtroom graphs, the public leak. He mapped variance distribution curves, regression lines, not as dry numbers, but as living evidence. Evidence of courses manipulated, potentials suppressed, futures dimmed before they began. He explained how bias could be quantified, how silence disguised as grading curves could become visible as pattern, how prejudice cloaked in professional language could unravel under proper analysis. The students listened. At first, a few exchanged glances. Some leaned forward. Gradually, the skeptical brows softened, the pens paused, and notebooks filled. Questions were raised, not out loud, but with furrowed brows and raised eyes. Keon projected more slides, comparative data between schools, demographic overlays, predictive models that showed long-term impacts when innocuous-seeming course policies disproportionately affected minority students. He showed how a single subtle comment from a teacher, repeated hundreds of times across dozens of classes, could accumulate into a structural barrier. By the time he advanced to his final slide, a simple statement, "Numbers don't lie but people do," the silence in the hall felt loaded, not with boredom or pity, with reckoning. After the lecture ended, The response wasn't immediate applause. It was a quiet, heavy pause, the kind that fills a room when reality shifts. Then a murmur. A few heads nodded slowly. A professor rose first, clapping once. Then two more. Then the rest of the rows followed, in waves, until the room sounded like thunder rolling across the mountains. In that moment, Keon felt a wave he hadn't anticipated. Not triumph, but release. The weight of being other, outsider, wrong. It lifted, replaced by recognition, by possibility. He stepped down from the podium and walked through the crowd. Conversation sparked. Older grad students congratulating him respectfully. Undergrads asking quietly how they could help make data equity part of their coursework. A senior professor approached later, eyes thoughtful, nodded with approval, and placed an envelope in Keon's hand. Inside was an invitation to join a year-long fellowship, a paid research position studying systemic bias in educational statistics. At 17, no hidden strings, no question of legitimacy, just acknowledgement. It struck Keon deeper than any grade or court ruling had. It wasn't gratitude, it was trust. Back outside under the midday sun, the campus seemed kinder. The trees lining the walkways swayed gently in a breeze. Students chatted smoothly as they passed, and the air smelled of autumn, crisp, open, promising. Keon stepped into the quad and sat on a bench, letting his mind catch up. The journey from being silenced in room 304 to being heard in this university felt too surreal. The years of data, of nights spent plotting graphs under a single bulb, of erased work, of whispered threats, they all felt like different lives now. And somehow he was still standing. Not just standing, laying foundation. But as the wind rustled the papers from the envelope in his hand, the unexpected came. A phone notification. An email. From someone he had never met. Someone outside his world. He unfolded the message with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The subject read simply, Story Rights Inquiry. The sender, a producer at a major streaming platform, known for documentaries about social justice and real stories of injustice. The body was terse but unmistakable. We want to bring your story to screens. Full feature documentary. Interest. Keon's stomach clenched. In one breath the moment felt like vindication, an opportunity to magnify the truth beyond statistics, beyond courtrooms, beyond campuses. In another it felt like opening a door that could never be closed. Exposure. Spotlight. More conflict. More risks. For him, for his family, for every person touched by this story. He looked around the campus again, a world that had accepted him today. But he remembered the halls of Hamilton Ridge, the locker note, the digital harassment, the whispers. He remembered faces, some sympathetic, many hostile. He remembered silence as power. And now the silence was over. The cameras might come, but so would new voices. Voices of survivors, of students silenced, of people with nothing left to lose. He exhaled slowly. The document in his hand felt heavy, but not burdensome, not regretful. It felt like purpose, a new pathway, a broader platform. In that moment, standing on the stone steps of the university building with the afternoon sun warming his back, Keon Matthews realized his journey had just entered a new chapter. He had turned the math class that once rejected him into a lecture he would never forget. He had turned silence into data, isolation into voice, dismissal into authority. And if the platform wanted to tell his story, he was ready. Because this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was everyone's moments after he saves the email and closes his laptop. A second message pops in, this one unsigned, sent from an unknown address. The subject line reads, Before you go mainstream, we have questions. Inside are previews, blurred images of school hallways, half-visible faces, names of students, and a single sentence, do you really want to open Pandora's box? Keon Matthews stepped into the small rented office space for the first time. Its walls bare, the carpet thin and gray, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. The room smelled of fresh paint and hope. He paused at the door, closed it behind him, and let the stillness wash over him. This was different than any classroom, any courtroom, even any campus auditorium. This space belonged to no system. It belonged to him, or more precisely, to what he intended to build for others. He placed a simple sign on the desk, Equity in Numbers Initiative. The letters were black against white, bold and plain. No flourish was needed. This was purpose over pomp. In the weeks that followed, Keon transformed the modest room into a command center, for a national nonprofit aimed at supporting underrepresented students in STEM. The early days were small. A handful of email addresses signed up, a few hesitant phone calls, some curious messages from students who had heard about his case or his lecture. But each contact, each request for guidance, reinforced the reason behind this decision. He didn't just want to give students help with statistics. He wanted to give them tools, confidence, and a sense of belonging in places historically shut to them. He dusted off his basement notes, scanned his slides, redrew his graphs, now cleaned up, modernized, formatted for clarity and accessibility. He compiled them into a free digital guide he titled The Silent Curve, a student's map to statistical confidence. It wasn't glossy, it didn't use heavy academic jargon. It spoke plainly, logically, data taught through empathy, through lived experience. He released it publicly on a clean website, PDF downloads, interactive charts, video walkthrough. The first wave of downloads came from his own city district, the next from neighboring states, then across the country. A freshman in Texas, a community college hopeful in Ohio, a high school junior in California, their emails trickled in, expressing thanks, relief, astonishment that someone had broken down what always seemed like locked knowledge. For many, it was the first time math had felt like a language they could speak, not a code written to exclude them. As downloads turned into demand, the nonprofit quietly expanded. Keon found volunteer tutors, some from his old court case supporters, others college students inspired by his guest lecture. They offered free weekly sessions, virtual, open to any student who asked. Subjects ranged from basic algebra to AP calculus. But the philosophy was consistent. Clarity, patience, respect. No assumptions about background. No tests to qualify. Just access and trust. Over time, the Equity in Numbers Initiative portal became a quiet network of data-curious young people. Some shy and unsure, others sharp and defiant, all united by the belief that their minds deserved the same chance as anyone else's. Meanwhile, Keon didn't forget the systemic roots. He began working with a small coalition of educators and civil rights advocates to draft a proposal for academic equity legislation. The draft focused on transparent grading policies, mandatory bias awareness training for teachers of advanced courses, and publicly accessible performance analytics for schools across the state. It was ambitious. It carried risk. It challenged institutions built on silence. But it carried hope too. The hope that future students wouldn't have to fight alone. In interviews with local newspapers and education magazines, Keon was careful. He didn't seek fame. He framed his cause as collective, not Keon's fight, but their fight. He spoke of patterns, not individuals, barriers, not guilt. He insisted on data, not emotion. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. In communities where whispers about favoritism and racism had long lingered, conversations turned public. PTA meetings asked for transparency. School boards requested audits. Administrations launched reviews. The legacy of what had started as a lonely fight in a high school classroom and a basement transformed into a growing movement. Students he'd never met, in districts he'd never visited, began using the Silent Curve guide to tutor younger siblings, formed study groups, mentor peers. One of the most touching messages came from a girl in Michigan who wrote that for the first time, she didn't dread statistics. Because of the guide, she felt seen. She felt capable. But with growth came scrutiny. The same systems that had tried to silence Keon began to circle, not with shouts, but with regulation and red tape. School districts sent cease and desist letters, claiming intellectual property, obscure references to curricula they had adopted years ago. A few conservative commentators on education blogs accused the initiative of grade inflation and undermining teacher authority. Anonymous social media accounts re-emerged, questioning his qualifications, the legitimacy of his data, the ethics of his recordings. The threats were quieter this time, not violent, but chained to bureaucracy, to fear, to doubt. It was the slow kind of damage that institutions knew well. Erosion over time, enough to wear someone down without raising alarms. Keon steeled himself. He responded publicly, with new downloads. An updated guide with legal disclaimers, a transparent FAQ, and a public log of every cease and desist letter, complaint or challenge submitted against the initiative. He didn't hide. He didn't plea. He exposed the pressure. The same pressure that drove him to build the movement. Yet something else began to emerge. Beyond protests, beyond papers. Even beyond policy, a community. Students, tutors, former victims of academic bias, and their allies started organizing. Keon helped plan the first national data equity rally. It was modest, a rented hall in Atlanta, a small online stream, handmade signs, flyers passed through community centers, churches, and school clubs. The message was simple: data belongs to everyone. Math is power, silence hides injustice. On the day of the rally, the hall filled slowly but steadily. Young faces sat next to older activists. Parents held nervous children. Teachers from public schools nodded in solidarity. The air hummed not with anger, but with possibility. Keon stood at the front stage again, not as defendant, not as dissolved victim, but as ambassador. He watched as speaker after speaker rose. Students who had used the guide, tutors who volunteered, parents who had seen opportunity opened for their children. They spoke not with fury, but with facts. Higher AP enrollment rates, better grades, renewed confidence, fewer dropouts. They spoke of data as legacy, and justice not as reaction, but evolution. When it was his turn, Keon walked to the microphone beneath soft lights and looked out at the faces. He didn't speak of his own pain. He spoke of code, of curves, of coverage. He spoke of numbers, and hope, and what happens when someone finally teaches the talk. As the final applause faded, and the crowd dispersed, Keon stepped outside into the warm afternoon air. The city noise felt distant, subsumed by the echo of voices, of solidarity. He walked through a sea of banners and signs, children laughing, cameras clicking, media vans queued at the curb. The movement felt alive, breathing, expanding, unstoppable. But one figure among the crowd caught his eye. A face he recognized. One of his old group project teammates from high school. The person whose team stole his work and erased him from the submission. She stood near the back holding a handmade sign with shaky letters. I was wrong. The edges curled. The marker faded in places. But the message was clear. The silent confession was raw. For a split second, time lens shifted. High school halls. Locker whispers. Erased data pages. Juxtaposed with this moment. Acceptance. Acknowledgement. Redemption. Keon didn't move. He just stared. Comprehension and disbelief warring in his chest. The rally noise blurred. The crowd faded. The sign remained. I was wrong. In that instant, the legacy he'd built, the nonprofit, the guide, the legislation talks, the rally, all crystallized. This was the movement. Not just policy change, not just public exposure, not even personal vindication, but transformation, healing, reckoning. He exhaled slowly. The past confrontation, the mockery, the silence, they had led here. And as he stood under the afternoon sun, among hopeful voices and renewed faith, for the first time, Keon believed it. Change didn't require fury, it required truth, told steadfastly, relentlessly, publicly. As the rally disperses and the crowd fades, a sleek black SUV parks at the curb. The rear door opens. A short, well-dressed woman steps out, holding a tablet. She approaches Keon with calm authority, smiles curtly, and taps the screen, revealing a high-resolution photograph of a young black student from his old class, one whose name had never appeared publicly. She glances at Keon's face, then says, without raising her voice, "We have footage, and if you move forward with that documentary, we'll have to release it." Keon Matthews stepped out of the black SUV and paused for a moment under the low gray sky, hovering over Hamilton Ridge High. The school's red brick facade, once intimidating and cold, looked different now. Older, perhaps softer, like worn stone shaped by season. He carried no prideful swagger. Instead, a silent calm accompanied him, one that belonged not to a kid hoping to belong, but to someone who had long outgrown that need. He walked toward the front entrance, each step measured, echoing faintly against the tile. Around him, students milled about, detached from the significance of the day, just another graduation. But for him, every corridor, every locker, every classroom spoke. They remembered. He remembered. And now he was returning not as a student carrying doubts, but as a voice carrying change. When he entered room 304, the same classroom that had once clipped his confidence before it even had a chance to soar, something inside him settled. The desks were polished, the whiteboard clear. Generic posters hung on bulletin boards fluttered slightly in the late spring breeze blowing through open windows. At the front, Where the chalk tray once held erased equations and erased dreams, now hung a single portrait, a photograph of Keon, mid-lecture at the university. The frame was simple, unadorned, perhaps chosen to avoid fanfare. Still, that quiet photograph radiated history. The class that once refused to see him now honored him. It was more than vindication, it was transformation. He walked slowly to the center of the room, hands relaxed at his sides. He glanced at the rows of empty desks, imagining them filled with familiar faces, some doubtful, some dismissive, and felt no anger. Not anymore. Instead, he felt a strange, gentle pride, accompanied by responsibility. He remembered the day he had raised his hand and was told silently to sit down. He remembered the notebooks erased, the group projects stolen, the locker notes, the online taunts, the accusations. All of it had led him here, and also far beyond. He exhaled softly and allowed the weight of the moment to settle, not as a burden, but as a foundation. Outside, the graduation ceremony carried on with typical fanfare. Caps launched into the air, parents cheered, cameras flashed. But inside room 304, time had contracted, slowed down. For a few minutes, nothing else existed but memory and presence. Keon walked to the front once more, reaching out with his eyes to the portrait. He let the silence speak, to the ghosts of doubt and shame, to the echoes of racist remarks and silent exclusions. He let it all be seen. Then he turned, stood straight, and addressed the empty seat. In his mind he spoke not to ghosts, but to futures, to every student who would come after, who might feel small in a big classroom, who might face the assumption that their mind wasn't built for these equations. And in that silent speech, carried not by words but by certainty, he declared, as much to himself as to anyone who would listen, that some minds weren't built for limits. Several days later, Hamilton Ridge held its actual graduation ceremony. The cheering, the tassels, the diplomas, all of it unfolded under a sky streaked with late afternoon gold. Keon watched from the front row as their principal handed out caps and diplomas, as each graduate stepped forward, shook a hand and walked toward the future. He wasn't meant to graduate that day, but in some strange arc of justice, destiny and perseverance, he was there to see what the school looked like when it moved on. The applause felt fragile sometimes, polite, practiced, but underneath it lay a crack, a disruption in the expectations, the quiet racism, the tradition built around exclusion. For every student ascending that stage, there was now a possibility, a chance to be seen. After the ceremony, families gathered in the courtyard, hugging students, tossing caps, popping confetti. Keon stayed quiet, observing. He felt separate, not because he didn't belong, but because he hung somewhere between chapters. He was both out of that world, and still defining it. As he made his way to the edge of the crowd, a small figure detached from the group near the back gate, a young black teenager, dreadlocked hair tucked under a worn backpack, approached him with hesitance. The boy's expression was shy, hopeful, a mixture Keon recognized immediately from his own reflections in a mirror long ago. The teenager fidgeted with the straps of his bag, lips pressed tight, as if gathering courage. He spoke softly, words tucked in humility. He needed help with a statistics question, something he couldn't understand, something overwhelming. His voice trembled just slightly, not from fear but from possibility. Keon looked at him. Really looked. He saw the weight of doubt, the flash of wonder, the longing for someone who believed in unseen potential. And for the first time in a long time, Keon didn't hesitate. He stepped forward. In that moment, the echoes of his own struggle, the humiliation, the erased data, the lawsuit, the lectures, all merged into clarity. This was what it had always been for. Not for portraits, not for headlines, not for fundraisers or rally, but for this, for the spark of curiosity in a young mind denied until now. He nodded gently, a quiet acknowledgement, as he squared his shoulders and motioned for the boy to walk with him. The world around them blurred into background, the music fading from the speakers, parents calling names, cameras flashing around. What remained was the chalkboard again, a clean space, the possibility, the numbers waiting to breathe. And Keon felt, perhaps for the first time, the full breadth of what he had rewritten. Not just his own equation, but the equation for every black boy, every girl, every student who ever heard "you'll never get this," and wondered if that was code for "your mind doesn't belong here." He smiled, not the shy, hoping smile of a kid begging for acceptance, but the steady, certain smile of someone who had built a path where there had been none. He reached for a notebook from his backpack, fingers brushing the cover in recognition of memory and resolve. The young student looked up at him, eyes wide, pupils shining with a mix of fear and trust. And in that small, unguarded moment, in the quiet before explanation, Keon whispered inside, not to the boy, but to the future. This was where it began again. Not with limits, but with possibilities. As Keon begins to sketch out the first problem on a scrap piece of paper, his phone buzzes. A message notification flashes on the screen with a name he never expected to see. Producer, Story Origins Media. The subject reads, ready when you are. If you've ever been underestimated for who you are, not what you know, then you already understand Keon's story. Because for some of us, the fight starts before the first question is ever asked. But the truth has a voice now, and it sounds like justice. Type yes if you believe brilliance has no color. Subscribe if this broke your heart and opened your eyes.